Okay. Agwina Ushla, you're all very welcome to tonight's Zoom talk here with Balbriggan and District Historical Society. It's an extremely wet night and we're all delighted to be sitting in our own little sitting rooms and so forth, and we're waiting fervently for the end of Zoom, but tonight it kind of suits because of that wet weather. We're delighted to be joined tonight by Declan Brady. Declan is a professional genealogist and a historian based in Swords, and he's currently completing a history PhD on the evolution of local politics in Fingal from the 1870s to 1948. He's in Maynooth, and he has been a John Hume scholar. The title of the talk, and sorry, at the end I'll give you a little bit of a piece about our own society, but the title of the talk tonight is Voters and Politicians, Elections and Local Government in North Dublin during the lifetime of the Rural Balrothery District Council from 1898 to 1930. You're very welcome, Declan.
Thank you. So I'm going to share the screen, and I will probably turn the camera off on myself while I'm talking. So just bear with me, and I might just get somebody, I will get everybody to mute themselves. Martin Fanning is not on mute, and Brian is. So I'm just going to share the screen now. If somebody can just put their hand up and let me know that is, yeah, thanks, Brian. So I'm going to talk about what local politics was like in Fingal during the lifetime of the rural district councils. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background first, in terms of the changes that were taking place in local government. Now, at times I might come across like I'm obsessed with local government, but when you look at the national government at Westminster in the 19th century in an Irish context, and you look at Irish people who are largely disenfranchised, it's through local government and through those local representatives that they come in contact with national government, that they start to roll back some of the, might call them deprivations if you want to go back to the time of the penal laws, but some of what they weren't allowed to experience because they were tenants or because they were Catholic or because they were Irish. So you have all of these divisions in terms of Irish history. We're only going to look at a very, very short period. So at this time, we're looking at a changing electorate in North County Dublin and a changing balance of political power in local representative bodies. Now that had started in the late 1860s in Fingal, a little bit actually earlier than other areas where you had moderate nationalists who were starting to gain power on the boards of guardians, on Balbriggan board of guardians, which was a largely rural, if not exclusively rural, board of guardians. North Dublin covered the North City, but also the areas out to Coolock, roughly say out almost to Malahide and parts of Finglas and Castleknock. So it was a kind of an urban and a rural mix. But Balrothery was almost exclusively, if not exclusively, rural. And it did have Balbriggan town commissioners as well in the same area, but they concentrated exclusively on Balbriggan. So you have this changing balance in political power, and it happens after the scare of the Fenians in the 1860s, the beginning of Home Rule under Isaac Butt, and then the land war from 1879 to 1882, and then the quest under Parnell for Home Rule. But there was this very slow progress that was being made in terms of gaining political power and gaining improvements for people through these local government bodies. In 1898, the Local Government Act was passed, and that was effectively a major game changer in terms of local power and local administration coming into the hands of nationalists. So looking at that kind of a quarter century from 1898 to the first post-independence elections in 1925, it happens before, during and after the Irish Revolution. And indeed, I would argue that the Irish Revolution would not have been a success without the layer of local government and its involvement in destabilizing the British administration. Now, one thing that is quite difficult in terms of my study, and it's why Fingal County Council is and Fingal Archives is so important, is the building that's there is the Custom House, which was burned by the IRA in 1921. And that held the central records of the Poor Law Commissioners and the Local Government Board, which means the only records we have of local government are those that are either in report form in Westminster or in local custody. We don't have what we'd call now departmental records, which makes it difficult to see two sides of what was actually happening. Although we do get that sometimes by looking at not just the records, the minutes of local government and the documents of local government, but actually looking at what was reported in relation to what went on at meetings in the press. So there is an extensive body of material there, but it's not easy to access over the 70-year period or 80-year period that I'm looking at. It just means that I have to read absolutely everything. The Local Government Act in 1898 was described by Michael Davitt in his book, The Fall of Feudalism, as the greatest of all victories won by Irish forces. What was it? There was increased representation, but what came with increased representation was additional taxation. There would have been a responsibility increased in terms of what was paid as the poor rate and additional taxation. And that was basically the carrot that was given to the landlord class and indeed the unionists in Ulster in order to get the legislation through Westminster. It brought, however, control, authority, and opportunity in different measures. Because you now had a greater nationalist cohort and nationalist balance within the bodies of local government, the local bodies, you also had increased oversight from the Local Government Board. So what they were given with one hand, they were taking away with the other. But those politicians that became members of Dublin County Council, became members of the Rural District Council, learned very, very quickly how to play the system. And there was always a balance between local and national. And an awful lot of the movement forward came from below. It came from local rather than, and from local personalities, rather than being managed by the Irish Parliamentary Party in any sort of coherent way. Pádraig Travers called it a bloodless revolution, where power was taken at local level without any shots being fired or without any particular violent revolution like we had in 1916 and later in 1919 to 21. Let's have a quick look at Fingal at the turn of the 20th century. So, under the 1898 Act, there was a number of Dublin urban districts that would have been also part of Dublin County Council: Blackrock, Clontarf, Dalkey, Drumcondra, Clonliffe and Glasnevin, Killiney, Ballybrack, Kingstown, New Kilmainham, Pembroke, Rathmines and Rathgar. All of these were unionist, bar two. Drumcondra, Clonliffe and Glasnevin, which was a middle-class Catholic nationalist suburbs, and New Kilmainham, which was closer to the city. Rathdown number 1, Dublin South, Selbridge, Dublin North, and Balrothery were all rural areas. In Fingal, the north and west was predominantly cattle fattening and grazing. Cattle that were raised in the west of Ireland would have been bought and sold, would have come to Balrothery, particularly areas like Garristown and the Knoll and north of Balbriggan, including Meath and further to Westmeath, and would have been fattened and then exported live. And that was a significant business in North County Dublin. The south and the east were more tillage farming, crops, a lot for the brewing and distilling and baking industries in Dublin. So you had Arthur Guinness, who had the biggest brewery in the world at the time, was getting his raw materials from North County Dublin, as were the many distilleries in Dublin, and the bakeries. Companies like Jacobs, Boland's would have milled in Dublin at the time. A lot of our flour is imported now, but they would have milled at the time. And again, they would have used raw materials from North County Dublin. And then you had market gardening and potatoes. So North County Dublin was the garden that was feeding Dublin City, but also there was a lot of export to England of vegetables and potatoes as well as cattle. And the North County fared largely quite well in terms of economics. I've read a lot of RIC, district inspectors' intelligence reports for this period, and say the period from the 1880s up to 1916, and quite often the same comment is made. The farmers of County Dublin, and they mean mainly North County Dublin, are well-to-do men, and it's usually in a peaceable state. It's only if there's going to be a poor harvest that you start to see any agrarian agitation beginning to stir, because that means that there'll be less work, and then that has its pinch in terms of labourers' ability to make work. When you have a good harvest, everybody tends to be happy. So this is where I find this fascinating. What's local politics? What's local government? And what constitutes local power, influence, and control? And that, in the 19th century, when we're under British rule, is an area that is often overlooked. And I tend to look at it, what makes a difference to people's lives? So there is legislation from central government, from national down to local, but there is legislation and then the ability to influence what happens by the implementation and the execution of whatever the policies might be, and also to bring things to the table in terms of making representations up. So it happens in terms of land, property, and housing. In 1884 and 1885, the Labourers Acts were passed that for the first time, public funding for labourers' cottages with a small garden was provided. There's the ability to change infrastructure, roads, bridges, water, sewage, anything that is local infrastructure that can improve everyday life. The influence is there within local government. There's law and policing. Now in Ireland, there wasn't the ability to get involved with the law and policing that there was through local government in England and Wales, because policing came directly under Dublin Castle, but there was some small opportunities. I've come across in terms of commerce, in terms of fairs, in terms of the regulation of shops, the regulation of hygiene and employment schemes, particularly during the 1920s and 1930s when there's severe unemployment. One of the ways that unemployment is tackled is by giving extra work on the roads. So you have road workers working for the council, and there's new programs put in place. The whole area of education, culture, sport and pastimes that's been facilitated and supported by local government, even at this time, is significant. public health and standards improvements, healthcare. Remember that the poor law guardians and the workhouses all have hospitals, they all have infirmaries, they all have small asylums. So in this whole period, the improvements in healthcare are happening through local government. There's no Department of Health, there's no Department of Social Welfare. It's all through the poor law unions and what we loosely tend to term the workhouse system. There's also issues in terms of religion and in terms of quasi-religious splits and sort of religious, ethnic, political splits within these bodies. And then you have the advent of political movements. So if we look at the levels of representation and the number of bodies in Fingal in this period, it's almost staggering to see, particularly in relation to today, where Ireland is far, far more centralised. And as being more centralised, there is less ability to use finance that's raised for more direct use. County Dublin Grand Jury, which was responsible primarily for infrastructure, Balbriggan Poor Law Union, North Dublin Poor Law Union. These are the dates that I've looked at in terms of the minutes, and would have read the minutes of nearly all of these between these dates. Balbriggan Town Council over a 80-year period, 90-year period. Holt Urban District Council, although that didn't really start until the 1920s, but there had been a parish council there. Dublin County Council itself, which was abolished in 1942 because there had been a significant amount of infighting, and there was also a ongoing rivalry between central government, the Department of Local Government, and various councils. Dublin wasn't the only one that was dissolved. There were 7 dissolved in the 1940s, and commissioners were put in instead. Dublin Balrada Rural District Council, North Dublin Rural District Council. So you had 2 levels after 1898. County Dublin Committee of the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction had significant clout in terms of education programs and in terms of improvements in agriculture. And then the Dublin Union, which replaced the North and South Dublin Unions in 1920, but remained until 1938. Now, through the 19th century, there was a lot of improvements and reforms that transferred a lot of what we now call local authority responsibilities to the poor law unions. The Poor Law Act of 1838 set up 166 poor law unions, each with a workhouse throughout the country, to replace the old system of what we would call parish benevolence, or parish based on Church of Ireland parishes helping the poor of the parish. It was an idea that was taken to Ireland from medieval England. It didn't work here, mainly because you had a large Catholic population in poverty in the 1830s, the ramifications of which we saw significantly in what happened during the famine after 1845. So poor law unions were set up, and a rateable valuation was put on land, and everybody then had to pay into via the poor rate for the upkeep of the workhouse and the poor. But with that structure set up, notwithstanding the reforms that were implemented in relation to the grand jury, and the grand jury, the problem with the grand jury was it was set up from the 23 largest landholders, and they protected their own interests, and they appointed and reappointed their own to the grand jury. There was no Catholics, or very, very few Catholics on the grand jury, and they would have controlled the expenditure. There was presentments and there was discussion, but they would have had the final say. And what happened in terms of where there were bridges, where there were canals, where there were railroads, came down to them, including things like harbours as well, the upkeep of prisons, the upkeep of courthouses and asylums. So through the second part of the 19th century, additional responsibilities were given. The Medical Charities Act opened up the infirmaries in the workhouse to what we would now call outpatients. The local poor were able to avail of the infirmary or the hospital without having to be an inmate of the workhouse. The Burial Grounds Act, Fingal County Council is now responsible for burial grounds and burial grounds legislation. That goes back as far as 1856, and they would have taken over responsibility from a lot of partly private graveyards. So there was once a row with Talbot and Malahide because he wanted to build on part of the local burial ground there, and Balrotary Poor Law Union was able to step in and stop that. Civil registration, births, marriages and deaths started in 1864. That responsibility was given to the poor law unions, and dispensary doctors would have been responsible for the registration of births and deaths, and it was usually clergymen that did marriages. The Poor Law Commissioners were the oversight board. They transferred to the local government board in 1872, and that helped in terms of democratizing to a small extent, not as far as 1898, but to a small extent in terms of curbing what would have been landlord power on the Poor Law Boards of Guardians. I mentioned the Labourers Acts that brought housing in. And then in the 1890s, you have potentially something that might be dangerous, but also something that is going to damage the roads, and also something that in terms of taxation can also be an additional revenue stream. And that becomes a very, very significant issue in Fingal, mainly because the main road between Dublin and Belfast goes through Fingal, and there was arguments over who should be responsible, the central funding exchequer or the local exchequer, being local government, for the upkeep of roads that were being used largely by people from outside of the area. In terms of franchise and qualifications, it's fair to say that most people did not have the vote because it was property based. So in the late 1700s, there were Catholic entitlements to vote. All you had to have was property that was valued at 40 shillings or £2. However, the constituencies were uneven and there was no Catholic members of Parliament. When Catholic emancipation was passed, they put the property qualification up to £10, which was 5 times what it had been at 40 shillings. The number of electors, Daniel O'Connell was able to sit in Parliament, but the number of Catholic electors went from 216,000 down to 37. There was various reforms after that. They dropped or changed the valuation in the Reform Act in 1850. The Secret Ballot Act was only brought in 1872. Before that, people would have had to vote publicly in front of their landlord or in front of the land agent, and obvious intimidation would have taken place. And the intimidation actually is kind of strange because we tend to think of it as somebody standing over somebody. But what would have happened in terms of intimidation was when people were voting, perhaps the land agent would have stood there and bought pints for everybody and drink for everybody, and people would have voted on the basis of who was giving them free drink. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of cases of them trying to close the pubs on days of elections. In 1884, the Representation of the People Act was passed, and that gave a male ratepayer franchise to anybody who was an occupant of their own, not a multiple occupancy, but of their own house. And the electorate went from about 226,000 to 750,000. However, multiple voting still existed. So if you had a number of properties, you had a vote for each property. And that meant that those who had the most property still held sway. In 1896, the Poor Law Guardians Act allowed women to serve as poor law guardians for the first time. And under the 1898 Act, there was limited female suffrage. So this was the first time that women had a vote, and it was ratepayers only. And to be a ratepayer, you had to be somebody who was an occupier, a named occupier in a house. women could be district councillors. They could be in the rural district council, but not county councillors. And there was other legislation then passed in 1911 to allow them to serve as county councillors. And then probably the biggest one, and the one we know most about, which was parliamentary based and applied to local government as well, was the Representation of the People Act, which facilitated the changes in the elections in Ireland in 1918, in December 1918, but all men over 21 and women over 30 with a property qualification got the vote. So how many people were there who actually had the vote in Fingal? Well, in Fingal in 1900, there was probably about 70,000 people in total in the whole county area. But only 10,000 had a vote in the Dublin County Council area. There was 1,700 of them in Drumcondra and 1,200 in Clontarf UDC area. Balrotary had just under 4,000, just over 3,500 in North Dublin. And the population, as I said, was 70,000 for the whole of the county, but the Fingal area was about 33,000. And that came from returns to local government. In terms of parliamentary representation, before 1885 and immediately after Representation of the People Act, County Dublin was a 2-seat constituency, and they were nearly family fiefdoms in terms of who they were. So between 1832 and 1841, there was a Conservative and a Liberal returned. After that, for the next 44 years, there was 2 Conservatives, and for most of that time, they were these 2 individuals. On the left is Ian Trant-Hamilton, who was the MP from about 1863. He followed his father, James Hans Hamilton. Some of you might be familiar with the monument to him in the centre of the town in Skerries. He had a lot of land around there. He had much more land around Castleknock. He was described by Andrew Kettle, the famous nationalist, who was a close disciple of Isaac Butt and of Parnell, as an orange deadhead, and had a reputation for being bigoted somewhat. But I have also found a lot of cases of where he was a very, very progressive farmer, and particularly in Castleknock area, was more than fair to his tenants. So you get both sides of that with most people. The man on the right is Thomas Edward Taylor, who was also an MP who lived at Ardgillan, and Ardgillan Castle was his seat, which he had swapped with his brother in the 1840s from land and a house that he had in County Meath. He was related to the Earls of Bective. The electorate grew from about 2,000 in 1832 to 5,000 in 1881, had peaked for a while in the early 1860s. And a lot of that was down to when there was campaigns usually by the Liberals, but also by the Conservatives, to make sure that everybody that should be registered was registered. Thomas Edward Taylor is an interesting character. Whilst Ian Trant-Hamilton became Lord Homepatrick just before he died in 1897, he was a second son. He was, in many respects, reminds me of George VI. He was quiet. He wasn't a good orator. He was a good organizer, but he wasn't a good orator. And his brother was destined to take the seat, and his brother died young. Thomas Edward Taylor was interesting because he was very, very close to Disraeli, and he was chief whip of the Conservative Party. So he actually sat in cabinet for a period of time. He was also Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. So he was very, very influential. I haven't read any of his specific correspondence because his handwriting was so bad. Most of what he had is illegible. So most of what I've got on him is from actually correspondence from Disraeli and from Disraeli's diaries. But they were very, very influential among the, let's say, the 6 Dublin MPs. They were called the Dublin Six, 2 from Trinity College, 2 from Dublin County, and 2 from the city. And what they were accused of a lot of the time was in pursuing their own Tory and Conservative objectives and not necessarily represent the city of Dublin. That all changed in 1885 with the change in the electorate. J.J. Clancy, the man down on the right-hand side, who had been the editor of the Nation newspaper, was elected. He never lived in the constituency. He lived in Dunleary, but he was elected in 1885. And for most of the time after that, except for 2 elections in the 1890s after the Parnellite split, when Joseph Mooney ran against him, and that prompted Edward Hamilton Woods from Milverton in Skerries to run as a unionist, hoping that the split vote would allow him to get in, but Clancy held his seat. And he held his seat all the way through to 1918. The man on the left is Andrew Kettle. Andrew Kettle was the father of Tom Kettle, who some of you may be familiar with from his career as an MP, as a university lecturer, as a poet, and as a soldier who died at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. But Andrew Kettle had been involved from the 1870s. In fact, he was involved before that as a land agitator. And as he came into he was born in 1833. So around this time, he's in his 50s, but he's in the background a lot, advising Parnell, advising Michael Davitt. He's quite close to these people, and he's almost a right-hand man on the ground for J.J. Clancy. Clancy spends most of his time in Westminster, as do a lot of the Irish Parliamentary Party. They aren't like the local representatives that we would see today. They saw themselves as representing the nation rather than representing their local constituency. They would correspond with them, they would make representations on their behalf, but they saw themselves as primarily part of that sort of caucus of the Irish Parliamentary Party, looking for the single plank objective of Home Rule. And it's not until later that they start to see the power of having grassroots organisations like the Irish National League and later the United Irish League, and the power to engage and the power to mobilise that exists through the local government level. So we look back at the County Dublin Grand Jury, you'll know some of these names: Vernon and Clontarf Castle, Gore Lindsay in Glasnevin. His house is where the Holy Faith Convent is now. Henry Alexander Hamilton was a land agent in Balbriggan. He lived at Hampton, and he was land agent for Lord Homepatrick. Anthony Hussey was a Catholic grand juror. He had about 600 acres in the Knoll around Weston, but he had about 3,000 acres in County Meath. Thomas Ainger, who was also a Catholic landowner from Roganstown, where the Roganstown Golf and Country Club is now, that was his house. Thomas Plunkett in Portmarnock had a brickworks, and his house was where the golf club is now in Portmarnock. Edward Hamilton Mudds had extensive lands that he farmed and leased in Skerries at Milverton. Warren St. Ledger Woods, who was his brother, had a house at Whitestown, which is just to the west of the motorway, kind of the bypass there at Balbriggan. Some of you will probably know that house. I was in it about 20 or 30 years ago before it was sold on. Edward Hamilton Woods, Warren St. Ledger Woods, Henry Alexander Hamilton were all related. They were all second and third cousins, and all of them were related to Ian Trant Hamilton, Lord Homepatrick, who was chairman of the Grand Jury. Grand Jury, a lot of them were related. They were related by marriage, and they also moved very much in the same circles, and it was a closed shop. And it wasn't until 1898 that a degree of their power was taken away. Now, when Dublin County Council was formed in 1898, there was 9 unionist councillors from the 30 councillors. But what was significant from my point of view is that 10 of the councillors were from Fingal. So the clout that they would have had in 1899 at the first meeting and in the years after would have been significant, because in terms of votes, having that kind of regional block was very important. The number of unionist councillors diminished fairly quickly. 3 of them were appointees on behalf of the grand jury at the first council. And then there was elections every 3 years after that. Robert Keating Clay was a barrister from South County Dublin. Frederick Shaw was an appointee. Veer Ward Brown were the family that owned Brown Thomas. Captain Vesey was a unionist from Lucan. Anthony Hussey, we've met already. Major Domville had the lands around Santry. Joseph and Patrick O'Neill were cousins who, between them, had about 160 acres each in Kinseely. Edward Rooney was from Lusk. Joseph Mooney was from Cabra. Probably the 2 that will jump out for people from Balbriggan is Charles Gallen, who had a linen mill in Balbriggan, and William Comiskey, who was one of the Comiskey brothers who were coal merchants and slate merchants in Balbriggan, and who were increasingly moving into farming. So you have all of these individuals representing North County Dublin on Dublin County Council. The first resolution, which actually jumps out, and it's overtly political, was proposed by William Field, the MP from Blackrock, and Joseph Mooney, that the people of Ireland are a free people with a natural right to govern themselves, that no parliament is competent to make laws for Ireland except an Irish parliament sitting in Ireland, and that we repudiate the claim of any other legislature or government to legislate or govern for the people of our country. These type of resolutions would have been banned, would have been thrown out in the 1870s and 1880s. At this stage now, you have a nationalist majority, for instance, on Dublin County Council, and you start to see more and more of these political resolutions. The first thing that exercised Dublin County Council in the first 2 years of their existence was the annexation of some of their what we'll call township areas to Dublin Corporation. Dublin Corporation had ongoing problems with people using the city but moving to the suburbs, Rathmines, Rathgar, Blackrock, Clontarf, and paying their rates there but using the services of the city. So there was an ongoing battle. One of the reasons that they were successful was because Clontarf couldn't afford to fund their own water system. So they had to be plugged into the Dublin water system. And part of the price of doing that was that they were annexed to Dublin. The unionist townships, Rathgar, Rathmines, Pembroke, held out for much, much longer. They didn't want to be absorbed into a nationalist Dublin corporation. And they would have formed part of that grouping of 9 unionists that were on Dublin County Council. So if you look at the balance that was there in terms of what moved, Clontarf elected 6 unionists and 2 nationalists to Dublin Corporation a year later in 1901. Drumcondra was nearly 50-50, 4 nationalists, 3 unionists and an independent. And Kilmainham, which was mostly artisans, artisan workers and craft workers, elected 4 nationalists. This is the first page of the first meeting of Balrothery Rural District Council. And if you look down through it, I'll highlight some of those that were elected. William Bannon was the clerk of Balbriggan Town Commissioners. You've Andrew Bell. Patrick Comiskey was from Balbriggan. Francis Derham was Skerries, moved down through a few others. Michael Dunn was a farmer from outside of Swords. Colonel Foster was a landlord in Swords. His house was at the north end of the main street in Swords, where the Fingal County Hall is. You've Charles Gallen, who at this stage was also a magistrate. Thomas William Hamlet was actually a business competitor of the Cummiskis, and he lived at Breamore, up near Breamore Castle. And he's interesting because in the early 1890s, he was a unionist. He was Church of Ireland. And by the time of these elections in 1899, he was describing himself as a Protestant Home Ruler. He had moved from a unionist position to a Home Rule position. And in looking at his experience in the 1890s as a poor law guardian, you see that he didn't fit into the same class as some of the other guardians, the landed guardians, despite the fact that he was unionist and Protestant. But he was a man who had a view of what was important. And that could have been coming from an urban area like Balbriggan. Some of the others, Anthony Hussey was there, PJ Kettle, an upcoming active politician, a nephew of Andrew Kettle. Some of the others that are there are from different parts of the North County. Richard Rooney was from Winestown near Old Town. And some of these become important as we look through the first decade of the 20th century. Some of you might notice there the magistrate William White. William White was the managing director of Smith's in Balbriggan. When we look at the first election of Balbriggan Town Commissioners under these new regulations and under the new regime, we have William Percival, who is a building contractor. Thomas Graham is a seed manufacturer. James McLew is a Goff is the same. He's a publican. George Mungy is a provisions dealer, a shopkeeper. They are not farmers. They are not landed. They are all businessmen. And that's the difference in Balbriggan with the rest of the county. In the first 10 years, we see that they very, very quickly get down to business. They very, very quickly get down to looking at how can they improve the local area. It's sprinkled with a lot of political resolutions that come up from time to time. There's support for the Catholic University. There's very little support for the council bill in 1907, which would have actually given control of about 6 government departments to nationalists, and probably about 30 what we call, similar to semi-state bodies, government agencies. But because it wasn't home rule, it was opposed by John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party, and the legislation fell. It was 1914 before a woman was first elected. That was Molly Adrian, or Mary Adrian, who was elected to Balrothery Rural District Council and Poor Law Guardians. And anybody who was elected to one was automatically elected to the other. And the meetings would have run one after the other. And the first Sinn Féin candidate, Frank Lawless, who fought in 1916, was also elected. And he had been a poor law guardian as his father had been before him in the late 1890s, had been elected as a nationalist, co-opted in 1902, and had moved slowly, having experienced what was happening with the nationalist power brokers, particularly the O'Neill cousins and Michael Dunn, and had moved slowly and slowly through his contacts in the GAA, through his contacts in the Gaelic League, into Sinn Féin. There were Sinn Féin meetings in Swords as early as 1906. And the Gaelic League and the GAA were used as networks, and they were used as cover. And by 1909, he was on the Central Council together with his brother, James Lawless. He was actually the spokesman for agriculture. So Frank Lawless was very, very close to Arthur Griffith. He was very, very close to the people like Eamon Cant, who were also on the executive at that particular time. So you start to see certain people in this period moving towards, as I said earlier, a position that allows them to take up arms in 1916. And Frank Lawless is very much like a political commissar in this period. He's not just a man who takes up a gun. He's a man who has certain convictions. He's a man who has gone on a political journey. This building here is the, if we look at the Poor Law Guardians for a moment, this is Valverde Workhouse. It looks like a fine hotel with the ivy at the front. So it may not have been as bleak at this stage as we might have thought, but it still was not, it was not a place that you necessarily wanted to go. What's interesting is in the few years just before the 1898 Act, the top attendees were William Boylan, who was the chairman for most of that 10 years from Jordanstown near Lusk, Anthony Hussey, Mark Perrin, who was a retired civil servant and a unionist, and Thomas Hamlet. And even though they didn't hold all the positions of chairman or vice chairman or deputy vice chairman, because they were at so many meetings, they ended up having the most influence because they were there voting. Half of the 10 highest attendees at that time were unionists, but there was also half of them were Catholic unionists. So they were looking at how do we improve our area, but also how do we protect our own interests? So they were protecting their own farming interests, they were protecting their own interests as landlords. This is where Balbriggan Union Workhouse is, the building that we've just looked at outside of Lusk. It's no longer there, but I have managed to get some aerial photography from Google, and you can see the layout of it there in terms of where it would have been. It's a kind of a horseshoe-shaped site. If we look at the officers that I just mentioned, a lot of the time there was like a stepping stone from the lower officerships up. So you went from the Poor Law Guardians as deputy vice chair to chairman, and then onto the Rural District Council. Patrick J. O'Neill from Kinseely was elected in 1899, and he held the position of chair of Dublin County Council for 20 years. And even though he lost, he was defeated in one election, he was then co-opted. And after that, he decided that there should be no more co-options. So the next time that somebody was defeated, there was no co-options. Dublin County Council had a lot of clout. It was one of the premier county councils in the country, and PJ O'Neill was also chairman of the General Council of County Councils, and ended up on a lot of committees at national level. For most of the period up to 1916, one of the unionist members was always the vice chair, Robert Keating Clay and Captain Vesey. After that, James Mahoney took over, was elected as vice chair. PJ O'Neill, during the war, was appointed, during the First World War, was appointed director of National Service, particularly to organise the agricultural labour effort in terms of making sure that there was sufficient food to feed the population, not just of here, but of Britain. But if you look across, he also held the chair of the RDC for quite an amount of time. Charles Gallen was there for a while, and Richard Rooney was there for a while. But you'll see the control that is there over a long period. So if you take from 1914 on, that 6-year period, Michael Dunn is representative of the Rural District Council on Dublin County Council. PJ O'Neill is chairman of Dublin County Council. both of them, one from Swords, one from Kinseely. Thomas L. Smith is nearly 10 years as chairman of the Poor Law Guardians. He is a farmer from Donabate. Richard A. Butler, who is from Pope's Hall near Skerries, was in and out of Dublin County Council, was in and out of chairmanship of the Poor Law Guardians. He set up the Farmers Union in Ireland in 1918. And then after 1920, those elections, which I'll come to in a moment, you see the big ground change in terms of the election of Sinn Féin. Molly Adrian spends 5 years as chairperson of the Poor Law Guardians. Interestingly, and very, very unusual, 2 of the officers are women. Lily Fogarty is deputy vice chair. She was an Irish language enthusiast. She was elected for Sinn Féin. Daniel Brophy was elected for Sinn Féin. James Woods was elected for Sinn Féin. But when we get to 1925, 1926, you start to see people coming back in who were not necessarily Sinn Féin, but you're talking about pro-split now. But Edward Rooney, his father, John Rooney, or his brother, John Rooney, and his father, Edward Rooney, had been elected at a much earlier stage. Edward Rooney was one of the first to be elected to the Dublin County Council. Peter Kelly, Christopher Brown, Thomas Monks are all under RDC, are Sinn Féin. Henry Friel had been a revenue commissioner who lost his job in 1918 because he refused to take the oath to the British government, originally from Donegal. He became chairman of Dublin County Council, was living in Holt at the time, but he left very quickly and took a job as Secretary General of one of the departments, the Department of Home Affairs. James McNeill was the brother of Owen McNeill. These to me look like they're not local representatives. We have a situation where we have, as I said, local representatives from 1899 on Dublin County Council. They are representing their interests, but their interests are the interests of Fingal and the interests of the local area. We have now people that their interest is the national situation. Their interest is independence, and thereafter governing Ireland from Dublin out and not from the ground up. And that's where the change happens, that this period of, I'm talking about 1899 for about 20 or 25 years, is the area of probably most significant clout and representation in the local area. There are various different motions throughout this period that actually give an indication of how Ireland is changing. I mentioned James Lawless earlier, that with his brother Frank, he was involved in Sinn Féin. He was also Secretary of Dublin County Council. And this is the first ever use of Irish language that I find in the Dublin County Council minute books, a letter read from the Secretary of Cumann and Ireland. First time we see on Clogh Gaelic. Also on the right, you have even more pointed criticism of the British government. And in this case, it was carried unanimously that the members of Dublin County Council hereby place on record our strenuous protest against the wanton and unjust oath taken by His Majesty King Edward VII, whereby he described the millions of his Roman Catholic subjects all over the world as idolaters and the most revered tenets of their religion as both idolatry and superstitious. This type of comment by Edward VII is taken up throughout the country. One of the reasons why local government is important in this whole period is it's part of a network. It's a network of correspondence. They're all talking to each other, and it allows a groundswell to be harnessed and mobilized, and that to greatest effect in 1920. Balbriggan at the same time is passing its own political motions. In 1914, they gave their heartiest support to John Redmond in the House of Commons in offering Irishmen north and south, despite their differences, to go wherever the firing line extended. And at the same time, they are passing motions on the death of Pope Pius. So they, on the one hand, they are supporting the British effort in terms of recruitment, in terms of mobilization, and then at the same time, or in the next breath, passing motions that are significantly Catholic. They also go on, sometimes almost ad nauseum, in terms of their praise of Redmond, and in this case, Home Rule triumph. Archdeacon Graham proposed, and Mr. Larkin seconded the following resolution, passed unanimously, that Balbriggan Town Commissioners take this first opportunity to congratulate Mr. John Redmond MP and the Irish Party on their splendid triumph in placing the Home Rule Bill on the statute books. We also feel proud of our own member, Mr. J.J. Clancy, who has successfully mastered the financial clauses of this important bill. A copy of this resolution is to be forwarded to Mr. Redmond and Mr. Clancy. So you have all of these local bodies trying to gain favour with the national politicians, and in some cases it's almost fawning. At the same time, Balbriggan is very, very conscious of its sons who are fighting in the First World War, and by Christmas they are placing on record sympathies to the children, fathers, mothers, relatives of the sailors and soldiers known to be killed. William McCann, Patrick Dowling, Andrew McKenna, and those that are missing, and those that are known to have been taken prisoner. So you have mixed emotions in and around this time. On the 10th of May, immediately after the 1916 Rising, Rotary Poor Law Guardians met, and they passed a motion proposed by Patrick Kettle and seconded by Michael Dunn, who had significant animosity towards Sinn Féin. In 1914, there was a motion put before, a written motion, letter came from Sinn Féin members asking for that Balrotary Poor Law Guardians would not support, or Rural District Council would not support Britain in the war. And Michael Dunn asked the clerk to roll it up and throw it in the fire, because that's about the only place that a motion from Sinn Féin was any use in keeping them warm. But what they have said here was, we deplore the calamity which has befallen our beloved country by the very unwise rising of the foolish dupes of wily German agents. Now, Molly Adrian is at this meeting. She was involved as a messenger between Thomas Ashe's camp near in North County Dublin, near Ashbourne, and the GPO in Dublin, and had gone in and out a number of times. They were also aware that Frank Lawless, a fellow councillor, had been fighting at this stage. Balbriggan don't meet, so there's no condemnation from Balbriggan. Dublin County Council meet very, very briefly, authorise and sign a whole pile of checks. The meeting takes about a half an hour. There's only a handful of people at it, enough to pass the checks and move on. But Balrotary Poor Law Guardians and Rural District Council stand out in terms of, let's say, the fulsomeness and the directness of their condemnation. And that remains on the books. It's not rescinded for a year until Thomas Ashe dies on hunger strike. And the horror which they have at that time of how Ashe was force-fed, it's only then that they condemn what has happened to Thomas Ashe and rescind that particular motion. By the time the Representation of the People Act is passed in 1918, we then start to see changes in terms of elections. National elections become far, far more important. The local elections that were postponed in 1917 are postponed again in 18 and 19 until 1920. Frank Lawless won in the new Dublin North County constituency with by about 2-1 in terms, and 69% turnout, which is a very, very significant turnout for that particular period. In 1921, the constituencies are redrawn. There's 6 seats. There's 2 elected. They're elected unopposed because nobody stands against them. Frank Lawless again, and Michael James Derham, who was a publican. He had been elected as a councillor in 1920. Sometimes he's known as Michael, sometimes he's known as MJ, and sometimes he's known as James or Jim. He's known as in the records by a number of names. But one of the things that happens is over the next number of elections, again, there's only 2 out of 6 seats in the new Dublin County area. In 1922, there's 3 pro-treaty, 1 Labour, 1 Farmers, 1 Independent. John Rooney is elected. His father had been elected. He was elected as a Farmers candidate. MJ Derham died in an accident. He fell down the stairs at his home in Balbriggan in 1924. And in the by-election, no candidate was elected. It was Bart O'Connor was elected, but he wasn't from the constituency. So you've nobody representing Fingal from the ground from 1924 on. Also, the turnout has gone, and again, people are probably tired, gone through the War of Independence, from nearly 70% to just over 40%. There were representatives appointed in the Seanad. John Coonahan was an agricultural expert. Richard Butler, who I mentioned earlier, was elected. Andrew Jemison, that's him down there on the right-hand side, from the distillery family. He was a unionist, but he had seen the writing on the wall. He's heavily involved in the brokering the truce in 1921, and again brokering a truce towards the end of the Civil War. Richard Butler ran again for the Senate in 1925 for the Farmers' Party. He was eliminated. John Cuff from Swords was also eliminated. That was a fascinating election because there was only one constituency and everybody ran, and there was a massive big count on it. Jemison was reappointed, and he remained a senator right up until he died in 1941. Ahead of the local elections in 1920, they changed the boundaries. Dublin County Council, the number of seats was reduced to 19. Swords had 4, and that included the whole of Fingal, even though it was just called 4. They also reduced the number of seats in Balrothery, North Dublin, Holt and Balbriggan. 12, Sinn Féin were returned to Dublin County Council, and the balance of power shifted. There were 3 unionists, 2 Labour Republicans, 2 nationalists. The North County area returned Henry Friel, as I mentioned earlier, Frank Lawless, PJ Curran, who was also a member of Balbriggan Town Commissioners, and Wilson for Labour. The turnout was just over 54%. The first meeting that they had, they suspended standing orders and declared their allegiance to the new Dáil Éireann. This would have been in July of 1920. Now that had its ramifications because it dragged the local councils into, let's say, the forefront of the War of Independence. There was issues over the collection of rates. Their grants were withheld by the local government board. The council buildings were raided again and again by both the military authorities and by the IRA in a battle for money and a battle to frustrate the operation of local government. And this is where local government plays its key and significant role in helping to win the War of Independence. It wasn't a war that was run by the use of guns alone. MJ Derham was elected chairperson of Balbriggan town commissioners. And what's interesting here is that some of the nationalists objected on the basis that he had taken his oath of office in Irish and that was technically illegal. And it was questioned by the local government board thereafter, but he managed to hold on to his seat. While Rotary Rural District Council, this is an unusual mix because it actually was a predominantly and very, very strongly Labour council. So Sinn Féin took 10 seats. The lone nationalist was Michael Dunn. They unanimously declared allegiance to the Dáil at their first meeting. Because Michael Dunn was actually absent, he was at a different meeting. They get involved and dragged into the War of Independence, but they have a number of Labour councillors, and this becomes the characteristic of this council for the next 5 years. You have those who are representing, let's say, the farmers' interest and Sinn Féin's interest, and those who are representing the workers' interests. And that battle continues through the decade. I mentioned that the boardroom was attacked on a number of occasions. There were British soldiers, not black and tans, not auxiliaries, regular soldiers from the Duke of Wellington's regiment who were stationed there. These are some of the older inmates that were there. And it comes across as quite a friendly and jolly photograph, but they wrecked the place and they would have taken away some of the minute books and some of the audit books and some of the ledgers from time to time. By the mid-1920s, this is one of the last photographs of some of the Balrothery Poor Law Guardians and staff. And you'll see that there are some objects still around Fingal. That's on the bottom left is a water pump, which is in one of the parks and swords. It's near the castle across the road from the new care home. And you'll see then Kishtin Amukt, Balrada. James Stack was the clerk of the union. The man sitting with the big moustache, Kerryman, in the middle of the front row is James Stack. He had his own letterheads, Oskelga. The man on his left with a hat that looks like a cowboy hat is Richard Rooney from Winestown. He was also a rate collector with Dublin County Council. And the only other person that I can recognise immediately is there's a quite a young, good-looking guy in the middle row, second from the left, with a white straw hat, very white collar there. That's Edward Rooney, I believe. Either Edward Rooney or John Rooney, I'm not 100% sure. But he would have been the guy who had run for the Farmers' Party. This is what Balbriggan Union Workhouse ended up like. It was taken over by squatters in the late 20s and 30s who were angry at basically the levels of poverty and the levels of a lack of housing. And it was knocked to the ground thereafter because of that. In 1925, and I'm nearly at the end, the election changed everything. We're talking about a period when post-1922-23 in the Civil War, you have a Cumann Gael party, which was not set up from the bottom. It was set up from government and then spread down. And they thought that they shouldn't be involved in local government. So you have a ratepayers party, Colonel Healy Hutchinson from Lisson Hall, who was a landowner, Edward Rooney, who was a tenant farmer, were elected. You have three Labour. Labour starts to take a hit and starts to go backwards in terms of its numbers. PJ Curran is elected as one of the Labour members for Dublin County Council. Paddy Belton, who joins almost every party in the 1920s and 1930s, is elected to Dublin County Council as one of the 4 from the Swords area. So Healy Hutchinson, Edward Rooney, PJ Curran and Paddy Belton are elected in the Fingal area. The turnout has now fallen to 42%. People are fed up with politicians, people are fed up with the war, people are fed up with the consequences of the war. The building back, to use an expression that's used at the moment, the poverty and the unemployment. The headline in the Irish Times was the apathy of electors, with some districts showing the lowest poll that they had ever shown. In 1925, we have another change in terms of who is elected to the chair, and Paddy Connolly was elected. Again, he is somebody from outside of Fingal. He would have been from Artane. So having had 20 years of the chairman being from Kinseely, and then having 5 years of sort of a number of changes of chairman, you're now seeing very much a marginalisation of Fingal politicians. In 1925, there wasn't really much difference. The Board of Guardians was dissolved in 1925. The RDC remained in operation as an adjunct of Dublin County Council until 1930. When it eventually was disbanded, it was almost on its last legs. It had been prescribed or dissolved or suspended for a short period of about 2 months, done by the local politicians themselves, who refused to strike a rate. And then there was a big row with the quantity surveyor, and it was mostly over details in relation to how work was done. So we're looking at a period when we have the greatest level of representation, we have the greatest level of control, we have the highest office attained. Fingal has clout. Voters have gone from enthusiasm to apathy, but it also creates the local politician. And afterwards, representation decreases. And in terms of TDs, it's not until the 1940s that you have locally based TDs elected again, because even though Paddy Belton is elected on a number of occasions, Paddy Belton doesn't live in the constituency, and Paddy Belton's some of you may know he built most of Donnycarney on his own land, and then he owned the pubs and he owned the shops and he owned the houses that he built and he rented them out. So he had a very different view of the world. It was mostly according to Paddy Belton, but the representation is reduced and the country becomes increasingly centralised. And that might be plausible, it might be viable, it might be acceptable because of the size of the country, but it does have its effect on the ground. So I'm going to leave you with something that is probably a little bit more lighthearted, but it's something that we'll all be familiar with. And it's in this period of the late 19th century and early 20th century that this individual sort of appears, the county councillor. I am a county councillor, a very public man. To benefit the people, I'll do everything I can. In all my waking moments, for their welfare I will scheme, and in the arms of Morpheus, improvements I will dream. A local legislator and a man of high renown, I'm the county councillor, the greatest man in town. And that's as old as 1900 in the Leinster Leader. Thank you. So that's
well done, Declan.
Thank you. That was a trip through local politics.
Excellent. I like the wording on the song there. It's 1900, but it's probably still fairly relevant, isn't it?
Oh, it's very, very relevant. But you see, we're on mind. That's relevant, and to what extent did this country always have stepping stones up instead of people that are dedicated local politicians who work for the local community? How many of them drop it and then head off into dialogue? Now, there is a balance between what works and what doesn't work. But what I find really interesting, and that's why I kind of was a little bit theoretical at the beginning, when you look at all of the responsibilities that were devolved onto poor law guardians and the Rural District Council and the County Council, in some respects, because I've gone through to 1948 in terms of my own work, I actually see that the local bodies have more power before independence than after independence. Dublin Corporation was dissolved in 1924. Cork Corporation was dissolved. Cork County Council was dissolved. 7 councils were brought to court in the 1930s over not striking rates. 6 or 7 of them were dissolved in 1942. So you had this ongoing battle between the Department of Local Government and the local bodies. And, you know, are local bodies better equipped to deal with local issues than national? Do they appreciate insights more, or is the country too small to do that? But I would argue that there is a different view of Ireland in the 20 or 30 years before independence, and I'm equally finding a different view in the 1920s to 1930s, which at some stage I'd love to come back and share the 1930s with you, which is a whole different ballgame. The 30s and the 40s when I finished my PhD. But no, that's so I'm glad I hope I didn't go on long.
No, it's fine. You're very welcome to come back again, Declan, without doubt. Just one of the contributors there, one of the viewers there, Ed Malarkey from Dusk, he says, congratulations, he's using the chat, which I don't think you can see at the moment. Congratulations on an excellent and well-researched paper. I would suggest as a possible project the typing of all the various handwritten documents, perhaps involving second-level students. I think all of the Balbriggan Town Commissioner documents is available online and searchable, isn't that right? It's not handwritten, but it is. And I don't know, Brian might tell us the other documents are available as well.
The town commissioners, Balbriggan Town Commissioners, is online, freely searchable at btc@informa.ie.
Yeah.
And that's open for everyone.
Yeah, and Declan, are some of the other minutes and so forth, which I think Ed is proposing, is suggesting that people should be able to search it if it was typed up or whatever. But I know the Balbriggan one is searchable even though it's not typed.
I have actually found, and the other Brian will bear me out on this, the only reason I know what I know is because it wasn't searchable. Brian would have seen me start at page 1 and read everything, and I would take notes on it, and that way I don't miss anything. I've seen where people have searched and missed a lot and don't get the feel for it. I do completely agree with having searchable material, but even newspapers, I'd start at the beginning and I read the whole newspaper, and it means I don't miss anything. So if something happens that, I give you a couple of examples, right? Something I wouldn't have gone looking for, and I promised Brian on the left that I'd mention this at some stage. The other Brian will probably know about it, but a couple of stories that other people mightn't know about. Just 3 of them that you'd never know unless you went looking. In the 1890s, there was an outbreak of rabies in Swords and Malahide, and there was 3 or 4 people bitten by a dog and had rabies. And the local medical officer was on holidays, and there was an intern, or not an intern, a locum in his place. And he said, I know a guy who has a cure for rabies. And they said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, he's in Paris, but he has a cure for rabies. So can we send these people? So they sent, I think it was George Proctor was one of them, a young guy who later joined the Merchant Navy. And there was another guy who was a farmer, I can't remember his name, and a third guy. And they were all sent to Paris, to Louis Pasteur, and it was paid for by the workhouse, it was paid for by the Poor Law Union. And in the minutes, it says, we better admit them all to the workhouse so that they're inmates, just in case anybody asks questions what we're paying. And I thought this was like phenomenal on behalf of Balrotary. Balrotary were thinking of these individuals, they were paying for them to go to Paris. The doctor went with them. They questioned why the doctor had to go to Paris for 3 months, accompanied them on the treatment. And one of the guardians actually said, have you ever been in Paris in the springtime? Ha ha. And that was the comment that was there. Now, you won't pick that up if you're searching by exception. Anyway, I thought this was really, really unusual, and that there was nothing more to it, until I discovered that they were all writing to each other. There was people going from Longford and Ballymena and Sligo and Tipperary to Louis Pasteur to get cures for rabies. So when something good happened, they told all the other poor law unions, they told the other rural district councils, and they took advantage of what they could. There was another one, and again, it's the type of thing you pick up by exception. There was a spike in the number of people in the 1890s at different times of the year as inmates in the workhouse in Balrotary. Now, you know where Balrotary is. It's a Balloch on the way between Swords and Balbriggan. But they found on different dates, the workhouse was packed. It was jammed. There was no beds left. And so we said, well, what's happening? Like, this is the summer. It's not as though it's snowing and it's bad weather and it's the winter. And one of the guardians said, do you not know? That's when Bellewstown Races is on. All the tramps came out of Dublin, booked into the workhouse like a B&B, got a feed, stayed overnight, went up, did their 3-card tricks and all their hawking at Bellewstown Races, and then came in on the way back. Or there was a time when one of the guardians was going through the accounts, and he said there's an inordinately high amount of whiskey being used in the workhouse. Why are we using whiskey in the workhouse? And another guardian said, oh, that was prescribed by the medical officer under section whatever. We can't question what the medical officer does. He was giving a tot of whiskey to all of the older inmates every night. So you had the beginnings of the county homes. So older inmates who would have been frail, who would have been not able to take care of themselves, would have went into the workhouse, and they would have been treated by this stage a lot more benevolently than, let's say, the time of the famine. But that was the end of it. They continued to provide the whiskey to them. But local government gives you, there's one, I did a talk before on the sewage system and all the sort of the 30-year saga of trying to get the water system replaced in Malahide. And that was a brilliant example of nationalists taking power, because there was an outbreak of cholera in the pipes on St. James's Terrace. Are people familiar with James's Terrace in Malahide? It's one of it's the Edwardian terrace at the side of the police station. Nearly all restaurants now. But the water and the sewage kept coming back up the pipes, and they wanted it changed. And actually, it was the two O'Neills and the two Kettle brothers who were on the dispensary committee and the sanitation committee in Malahide. And they refused to sanction it until they either only charged it to St. James's Terrace or put new water in for the whole of the area. So if everybody was going to pay, everybody should get the water. If only James's Terrace was going to benefit, well, then James's Terrace should pay for it. It took from 1870 to 1910 for that to be resolved. and it had to be resolved by an Act of Parliament. But that's one of those little sort of wins for nationalists at that time. There are there's probably a book in this, but there's multitude stories like that that are all positive in terms of local government in that period. For instance, Balrotary had the highest, you will love this one, Brian, and this I found in 1936. Balrotary had the highest library book loan rate of any rural district council in the country. And they were thrilled with that because they would have seen that as a measure of success. So there's just some of the little stories in and around local government. But I was delighted to come and talk about it. I see Bernie says there's a house on Hampton Street with a plate saying Balrotary RDC. There's lots of little things all around the place. I'd say the one to really look at is the shores. Look at the manhole covers and see if the manhole covers are from that period and have RDC on it. I know some of the water pumps do. You might even find that, I suspect Balbriggan has lampposts because they had their own lighting in the 1890s. So you may still have some of the stamps on lamppost, old lampposts in Balbriggan.
Yeah.
I could stay here talking all night.
Indeed, I remember, must be at least 10 or 12 years ago. Yeah, sorry, we're going to finish up now shortly, but I do remember about 10 or 12 years ago, we had a speaker talk to us about manholes. And I remember at the time a few people saying, what in the name of God are we doing here? But it was brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And it was along those lines of what you're saying there.
Well,
okay.
without being rude, my father-in-law asked about, I was given a talk in Malahide one night about the sewage system. And my wife said, he had asked, where's Declan? And she said, oh, he's off talking SH1T again. And my father-in-law said, the same. No, he is actually this time.
Very good.
But that was fascinating, that one, because the arguments that went back and forth over water and who should for water were there in the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s. And actually, I gave that talk about 5 years ago at the time when water rates were still kind of in the news here. So some things don't change. And remember that when we see things now in colour and we look at the past and we think the past was black and white, well, it wasn't black and white when you were in it. It was real. Everything was in colour. Everything mattered the same as it does now. And that's the beauty of local government records, is they talk about everyday life and they talk about everyday challenges. And I only talk really about some of the highlights and some of what happens politically. I'd love at some stage to talk about something that was completely mundane. But then nobody wants to come and listen to somebody talking about something completely mundane. Anyway, thank
Declan,
you.
I wanted to say thank you very much to you. You're very, very kind to come along and come along from your own room and talk to us. It's been very interesting. It's a topic that a lot of people are very, very interested in. I just want a little bit of housekeeping to do, I suppose, just to say our own society have been very fortunate. We've reached our 40th anniversary. In July 1981, it was set up by a number of people. There's only a few of the founder members still around, and that'll be Jim Walsh and May McKeown and we had the great fortune to be invited in as a result of our 100 years anniversary of the sack of Balbriggan. We had the great fortune to be invited in by Michael D. Higgins 2 weeks ago there on the 13th of October, and we had a fantastic time. He gave us a great welcome, and all of us that were there said our hearts were gladdened enormously And we were thinking about all the founder members and the former members and so forth, because we're all guardians of the history as such, you know. We had a great time. We met the head gardener, and May McKeown, I know she's listening there. She was presented with a beautiful bouquet of dahlias that were propagated by her brother in Canada, and they're growing in the garden in Orsnuptron. And they were also winners of a gold medal in Chelsea garden show, a flower show. So we had a spectacular day. We even got to meet Mishnach and Bro, the dogs as well, and we had great fun. Our AGM, now we'll have some news on that. To be very honest with you, we were going to go in person. Just the last little while, we'll be making an announcement on it very shortly. It is the last Wednesday in November, but I highly suspect we're back to Zoom. But we'll figure that one out. We have a committee meeting next week. Other than that, thanks very much. I know there was a few new people that joined us here tonight, and delighted that you came along, and I hope you enjoyed it. But a huge build-up to Declan there. Excellent talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well done.
Bernie, is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, just from my own point of view, just well, thank Declan very much and we're delighted that we'll be able to make this available on our website for anyone that that wants to watch it, that wasn't able to. And that absolutely fascinating. The story about people going to Paris like for treatment is just unbelievable. Like, you know, it's just really, really interesting as to what was happening, what you can find out from those records. Fascinating talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Declan. We'll bring it to a close then. Thanks very much. Thanks,
Okay.
Bernie.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Good night.